For coming and joining us here at Chelsea Academy. Thrilled to have you all here in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley. Before we get started here with our first panel, some great friends of mine here on the panel, I want to have our headmaster, Dr. Diarmuid Wheeler, give a few opening remarks. So, Dr. Wheeler, please welcome Dr. Wheeler.
Good morning, everyone. I feel really awkward standing here in front of the stage without a podium. I'm not used to it. But good morning, truly warm welcome to each and every one of you, and especially to our beautiful campus here in Front Royal, Virginia. It's our absolute pleasure to host our second annual conference, Screen-Free Childhood, Cultivating Virtue in the Internet Age. But before we begin and get things underway, let us take a moment to invoke God's blessing upon our gathering here. As a community under the patronage of St. Thomas More, who of course, as many of you know, was a man of profound integrity, wisdom, and steadfast faith, particularly in challenging times, we turn to his example. So let us pray. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of this day and for bringing us together here at Chelsea Academy. We ask for your divine wisdom to guide our discussions and reflections on screen-free childhood, cultivating virtue in the internet age. Grant us the clarity of thought, the openness of heart, and the courage to seek truth in all things. Inspire us through the intercession of St. Thomas More to discern how best to prepare our children for this ever-changing world, while always upholding the dignity of the human person and the sacredness of family life. May all that we do today be for your greater glory and the good of your people. In the mighty name of Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. So, as you settle in, just take a moment to look around, even just in this beautiful room here. You're here because, like us, we recognize that the very fabric of childhood is being profoundly reshaped by this digital age. And we see the clear impact. The constant presence of screens, the allure of social media, and the pervasive digital noise are presenting unprecedented challenges to the healthy development of our adolescents. To their capacity for deep learning, and to their ability to engage in sustained intellectual inquiry. And as we grapple with these immediate challenges, we also look to a future that is transformed. Transformed by artificial intelligence and automation. And our students will navigate this world where technology is essentially increasingly integral to professional life, or so it seems. This is precisely why Chelsea Academy, as a classical Catholic school, feels that it is a profound responsibility to lead this conversation. And our distinctive technology policy here at the school emphasizes a screen-free environment. It isn't simply a rule, it's actually a living expression of our conviction that true learning and cultivation of virtue flourish when students are immersed in God's creation, in authentic human relationships, and are free from the overall distractions of addictive technology. And we believe that this focus is especially vital for our parent community, offering practical guidelines for navigating social media and technology within the home, and addressing the complex challenges that our students and families encounter in the digital landscape. So how do we as educators and as parents prepare our kids for this technologically rich world in which we're inhabiting, while ensuring that technology remains a servant to human life and the human family and not its master? How can we best partner with you, our families, to safeguard children from the unique presence of the digital age? Well, these are all the essential inquiries that bring us together here today. It's not merely to lament the challenges, but to seek wisdom and to share strategies and forge a path forward, rooted in timeless truths. Before we dive in, a quick note on our approach to technology during the conference itself. In keeping with the spirit of a screen-free childhood, we encourage you to embrace this opportunity for focused engagement. We invite you to silence your devices, tuck them away, and fully immerse yourselves in the discussions, the insights, and the invaluable human connections that will unfold. Let's cultivate a space where deep listening and thoughtful dialogue can truly flourish. I won't draw rattle on for much longer, I promise. We're incredibly fortunate to have convened leading voices at the intersection of technology, family life, and education. You'll hear from these experts who have deeply considered the societal impacts of digital technologies, practical strategies for parents, and the philosophical underpinnings of a virtuous approach to the internet age. Their collective wisdom will be invaluable to all of us. And now, to kick off our first panel, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce your moderator, the Executive Director of the Chelsea Academy Foundation, a man who has written widely on issues of faith, culture, and technology, Mr. Emile Doak. Emile, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Diarmuid. Excellent framing of the conversation today. Just a few things before I kick it over to my far more learned and written way more widely colleagues here on the stage. My thinking about this conference and the genesis of wanting to do this really did stem from that unique tech policy that we have here at Chelsea that Dr. Wheeler had mentioned. But the more I talked with a lot of our families, the more that I saw how this played out with our students, the more that I realized that it really stemmed from a broader way of thinking about how we approach modern technologies. And that's kind of what I want to get into in this first panel here. A spirit of adventure is one of our big pillars here at Chelsea. You are currently sitting in our transformed cafeteria, but most of our students don't have lunch here during the school day. We ship them outside, even when it's cold, maybe a little colder than we should. But so that is a big part of what we want to do here is get our students outside, get them out in the real world and not under that pixelated unreality of screens. That said, as Dr. Wheeler mentioned, they'll be navigating a very technological world. We want our students to be successful in this life and the next. And so we want to make sure that they're prepared to understand really how they should think about modern technology, AI, the automation revolution. And it's around the same time that I was thinking about this, there was a great sort of manifesto published in First Things magazine that a number of the guys here, I think almost everybody actually involved at the conference today, was really involved with drafting and putting out. This was a future for the family, a new tech agenda for the right. I would totally recommend that you go check that out. And I want to get into a lot of the sort of ethos behind that here today. But one of the pillars there was to send your kids to a school like Chelsea with a tech policy like Chelsea. So plug for that at the outset. All that said, though, I think that document really provides a great framework for thinking about the sort of upstream issues of tech, right? Why we have this policy here at Chelsea, the way that we think about these modern technologies, and then also how we can form our students to be successful, again, in this life and the next. So that's the thinking behind our first conversation today. I want to look at both the challenges. We're going to talk a lot about the challenges of modern tech today, especially on our last panel, when we talk about practical steps that parents can take to protect their children from some of these devices, but also the opportunities. A number of the guys here on this panel have done great work looking at the real opportunities to have a human-based technology. So that's the idea today. Esteemed panel joining us. I'm going to give each of these guys about 10 minutes to kind of lay out their thoughts in that general framework before we get into a little back and forth, and then hear from you guys with some audience Q&A. So first up, right to my left, to your right, Jonathan Askonas. He's an assistant professor of politics at Catholic University, currently on leave, serving in the administration with the policy office of the Secretary of State. One of, I think, the clearest thinkers about how, especially Christians, should think about AI and technology. Done a lot of great work on that. So I will turn it over now to John Askonas.
Thank you so much, Emile. It's my great pleasure to be here. As Emile said, nothing I'm saying reflects the policy of the State Department of the U.S. government or anyone besides myself. For the last 4 years, I've had the great pleasure of leading a seminar on the philosophy of technology every summer with Mary Harrington and Nathan Bukowski, and I'm especially pleased and honored that my other two panelists here were students at various points in that seminar. And we spent an entire week, 6 to 8 hours in the seminar room just on one question: what is technology? And I think it's a question that in our conversations about technology in the policy space often goes unasked. And I think that's a problem, because I think it leads to two really critical conceptual errors that make it impossible to really grapple with what technology means and how it affects our families and our children. The first mistake is thinking that technology is the same thing as a tool. In fact, not only is this not true, it's almost the opposite of true. Tools, humans are tool-using creatures. But the tools that we make, for most of human history, the tools that we made are tools that we invented, that we created in the chorus of practices and communities that had a way of living. And we made tools to advance and further and make less burdensome our existing way of living. And of course, over the span of many decades and centuries, these tools would impact on us and change our way of living. But the tools were created out of an existing way of living, and for the purposes of that existing way of living, even though they changed it over time. Technologies are created precisely to revolutionize a way of living. There's this intrinsic connection between technology and capitalism, technology and the modern state, where we are identifying problems, and the word technology, techne logos, applying scientific practices to ways of making. So we're going to use science. We can use our discoveries about creation from the scientific method, and we're actually going to, from first principles, reinvent ways of making. We reinvent practices of living in ways that are that are designed to change how we live. So tools, as a human practice, come from our ways of living. Technologies are designed precisely to change how we live, right? And this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's some of those we wouldn't have. We're sitting in a nice air-conditioned room with electric lights and clothes that we didn't sew ourselves, and wonderful coffee shipped in from very far away. There's a lot to be said about the bounty and from a technological society, but it's a very different kind of society than a traditional society. That's the first mistake. The second mistake, even more foundational, is to think that a tool or a technology, the meaning of it is what it does. And again, this is something that's not only false, but almost the opposite of true. One of our great theorists of technology, Marshall McLuhan, said that the impact of a medium, the meaning of a medium, and for McLuhan, medium is another word we could say for technology almost, is its effect on the way it changes the scale, pace, and pattern of human life, right? So think about a hammer. What a hammer does is it pounds a nail into a piece of wood. But the effect of a hammer, the change it has in the scale, pace, and pattern of human life, might be you can make things much more easily, make certain kinds of things much more easily and not others. Maybe certain kinds of people are able to build things in ways they weren't able to do before, so to change sort of social structures. McLuhan's favorite example of a technology and the impact of a technology is a light bulb, right? What a light bulb does is emits light. The way it changes the scale, pace, and pattern of human life is revolutionary. It means you can do things at night that you can't do during the day. It means that colors look differently under electric light than natural light. So fashion changes. There's all this, the manifold implications of the light bulb have only marginally to do with the thing that it does. So if you focus on what it does, emits light, you'll never understand the real impact that it has on society. So what does this mean for, and another kind of thing, I think related to that is that the word technology is quite a fluid word. If you look back at its 200-year history, what you'll find is that when people call technology, is simply whatever is most disruptive to the way of living at that moment in time. And as soon as society sort of fully adjusts to it, we forget that it's technology. So nobody, if somebody says, is talking about technology policy, nobody's talking about refrigerators. Well, 100 years ago, refrigerators was high technology. Nobody's really talking about radio or television. Well, 50 years ago, television was high technology, right? So when we use that word technology, it seems that what we're usually referring to is whatever new technological mode is most disruptive to our way of life. So I think today when we use the word technology, certainly in this conference, people are mostly thinking about digital technology. And now we can add artificial intelligence as the natural extension of digital technology. And I think that one of the most important ways the digital technology, we're going to spend the rest of the day, I think, mostly talking about digital technology, changes the scale, pace, and pattern of human life, is that it's a technology of information. That's the thing it does. But the way it changes scale, pace, and pattern of human life is it removes any barriers to the spread of information, which means what becomes scarce is attention. So digital technology, the impact that it has is the technology of attention. And so I think, as Christians, attention plays a very interesting and important role in Christian formation. The kind of monastic tradition and the Eastern tradition have spent a lot of time thinking about attention. If you're a monk in a cell, the thing that you have to master most is your attention. And so practices like the practice of hesychasm, which is an Eastern Orthodox practice of constantly saying the Jesus prayer, you can't understand it as it's not about the words you're saying, it's about the way your attention is being focused. So thinking about how do we cultivate attention in ourselves and how do we cultivate it in our children. I don't like, I have a sort of slight critique of the phrase "a screen-free childhood," and it reminds me a little bit of something that the Orthodox say about fasting, which is that a fasting without prayer is a devil's fast. Right? If you take something out, it's not good enough to take something out. What matters is what you put in, what you are paying attention to. What I think what you're trying to cultivate here, and what many of us are trying to cultivate, is not only a screen-free childhood, it's a creation-filled childhood. It's an adventure-filled childhood. It's a wonder-filled childhood. And of course, screens are an impediment to that. They're something that can suck attention away. But it's not good enough that you've sort of just taken screens out. So what are you filling it with? The other reason I don't like the term is, McLuhan, I think W.H. Auden or someone once said, or somebody told McLuhan that W.H. Auden had said he didn't own a television. And then McLuhan said, Auden's a fool if he thinks that makes a difference. And what McLuhan meant was, in this context, there's no hope of having a screen-free childhood. Not because we live in a world of screens. We live in a civilization, a culture that's defined by digital technology. This hit home this week. Our son is away at a Christian summer camp for a week, first time at sleepaway camp. And, my wife and I, in our paltry way, had to prepare him for the fact that even though it's a screen-free camp, I'm not worried about anybody smuggling in a smartphone. Or maybe I should be more worried. But the kids around him have been shaped by screens in ways that may have been shaped by screens in ways that we don't anticipate, including shaped by pornography, even though he's 8 years old. Right? That's an unfortunate reality. So to cultivate a creation-filled childhood, it's not merely enough to remove screens. You have to fill it with something, and you have to be very intentional and understanding of the other ways in which, as the headmaster said, we are living in a society defined by this technology, whether or not we use it ourselves. And the most dangerous thing is to assume that because we don't use it ourselves that we're not affected by it. Last thing I'll say before turning it over to my wonderful colleagues is, for McLuhan, the way that you respond to technology is not just to try to kind of push it out. Again, it's an impossibility, actually. It's to create an anti-environment. To think about what are, given this change in scale, pace, and pattern of human life, what is the environment that we can create that cultivates the virtues that are needed to respond to that change? And this is where, I think Chelsea Academy and schools like it are so important, right? It's about creating an anti-environment. The purpose of removing screens is not because screens are bad in and of themselves. It's to create an environment where we're cultivating attention and virtue, so that when our children go into the world that will have plenty of digital technology in it, they have mastered their attention. If mastery of attention is a thing that becomes scarce and difficult in a world defined by screens, we've formed them in a way that equips them to respond to that. So that's a really important and vital work that I think Christian education is doing and Chelsea Academy is doing today. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I think that's actually a really excellent framing for the conversation today, thinking about where our attention goes when we get off these screens rather than just the the goal of removing the screens themselves. And I think it's a good setup, hopefully, for Jared's remarks as well, which talks about what then should fill that and how we should think about the sort of philosophical side of these technologies that we are hopefully removing for something greater. So I'll turn it over now to Jared Hayden. He's policy analyst for the Family First Technology Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies, a really excellent organization based down in Charlottesville. Jared is not based in the great Commonwealth of Virginia. We won't hold that against him. He's in D.C. But I'll turn it over now to Jared.
There we go. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for the chance to be here and to speak today. It's so great to see all of you out and to see just the concern and the investment in these issues from folks like you. My goal really in my kind of opening remarks is to just outline some anthropological concerns and think through the project of classical education, very, very kind of fairly broad strokes here, but think through the purpose of classical education in this context that John has outlined. I think one of the things we don't tend to think about is how technology is shaped and how it does shape, both has and currently does, our self-understanding and how we relate to one another. So I think I want to start off with just acknowledging that there's really no denying that modern technology has made life better. Modern medicine, like penicillin and vaccines, alongside advances in sanitation, have dropped mortality rates and increased life expectancies. Agricultural technologies and refrigeration, as John mentioned, have helped produce and preserve previously unimaginable quantities of food, leading to better nutrition. The telegraph, telephone, now the internet keep us more connected and informed than ever. And so I want to just acknowledge that in these and countless other ways, modern technology is in a lot of ways a blessing and a gift, a kind of common grace, as my Reformed and Presbyterian brothers and sisters would put it. And I think to say otherwise would be a mistake. But yet, like all created things, modern technology is alloyed. That is, it's a mixed blessing. And I think the Catholic Church has done a really good job at getting this right. Actually, a long time ago, at least over 60 years ago, in the Pastoral Constitution, God Made Space, where the Church observed that this transformation had, quote, brought serious difficulties in its wake. While man extends his power in every direction, he does not always succeed in subjecting it to his own welfare. On the one hand, as a creature, he experiences his limitations in a multitude of ways. On the other, he feels himself to be boundless in his desires and summoned to a higher life. And in its final analysis, God Made Space really argues that these tensions introduced by modern life ultimately confront man with a crisis, specifically a crisis of anthropology. It says, in the face of the modern development of the world, the number constantly swells. The people who raise the most basic questions will recognize them with a new sharpness. What is man? What is this sense of sorrow, of evil, of death, which continues to exist despite so much progress? What purpose have these victories purchased at so high a cost? And this matches analyses of other folks. I think of Protestant theologian Ephraim Radner, who describes the modern age as one in which our existence as creatures, as beings that are finite and created and embodied, how that's really been obscured in an age where our technology pushes the limits and the bounds of so much. But of course, compared to the present, the world of which God Made Space speaks is fairly antiquated. In the 60s, personal computers and the internet weren't even really a thought in the public's mind. And yet, over half a century later, the televisions, radios, and telephones of the 60s have been really replaced with high-powered, handheld mobile devices, the internet, social media, chatbots. And while our technology may be different and might, to John's point, seem more revolutionary today, because that's how we tend to use and think of the word technology, each of these technologies have shaped how we engage and think of the world and ourselves. And as Neil Postman, following Marshall McLuhan, noted, our technologies actually teach us to, as he said, construct the world as one thing rather than another, to value one thing over another, to amplify one sense or skill or attitude more loudly than another. And for Postman, new technologies especially, they're revolutionary because, as he put it, they alter those deeply embedded habits of thought which give to a culture its sense of what the world is like, a sense of what is the natural order of things, of what is reasonable, of what is necessary, of what is inevitable, of what is real. And so I think, Catholics have really gone a long way in noticing the transformative power of this technology in the instance of something like birth control, right? The pill, as it's often pointed out, really reshaped and untethered our ideas of sex, gender, marriage, procreation. And what was normal or natural or necessary was called into question because of this technology, because the pill introduced a new normal, a world where sex could be had without consequence and without commitment. And what I'd like to maintain is that far from resolving this crisis of anthropology that was launched very well underway in the 60s, today's technology has really only augmented it. And I'll just offer a few examples here, and we can discuss this more. But if you think about the personal computer or laptop, right? The distinction between software and hardware is now applied to the human. We more readily think of knowledge as data downloaded to the hard drive of our minds rather than forged through our experience and engagement with the world. Or just think of how much our mobile devices shape our sense of what is reasonable. In the era of smartphones and the internet, everything is just one tap away. Slowly but surely, any kind of lag or delay becomes increasingly unbearable, becomes grating. We become impatient. Delayed gratification seems impossible. Focus and long-term projects become more daunting than ever before. And this is especially true, I think, of younger generations who've been raised on these things. Or you could think of social media and the endless elasticity of the self, right? That you can present however you want online. And I want to note that these shifts, particularly in our social imaginary, the way that we think of the world and ourselves, these were really, in a lot of ways, already in motion before the PC or the smartphone. I don't want to say that these things have totally introduced something radically new, though I think you could evaluate each technology by itself. But I think, these things augmented what other technologies like everything from really the printing press to the microwave had already begun to reshape when it came to how we think of knowledge or our tolerance for delay. But I do think that unlike these older technologies, PCs and the smartphone saturate modern life in really unprecedented ways. And to John's point, they really vie for our attention. It's an attention issue. I think where something like AI and automation comes in is that it probably confronts the average person more clearly with this crisis than other technologies, and especially as we're on the kind of cusp of this. And I think you can see this sort of in the dichotomies, right? AI promises more knowledge, but as a number of studies have come out, it actually makes us less smart and less engaged. It promises more efficiency, but again, I was just talking with Brad recently about a study of software engineers that were given, these are the people who are most likely to use AI, to use it efficiently, and they gave two groups of software engineers, one group to use AI, another group to not use it, and the ones that used it actually were less efficient in their time, and they weren't able to get as much done because of the distractibility that comes with using AI. And then even looking at something like, AI promises more companionship, but it actually makes us more alone. There's a lot that could be said about that, and I know, Emma, you probably have some comments and thoughts on that. But I want to set that up as this is the context into which classical education really is operating today. And I think that we have to understand this project of classical education taken up by schools like Chelsea, that it has to be understood and engaged. So, and I want to take a kind of step back here as well and acknowledge, yes, sure, as often marketed, classical education can develop students with critical thinking skills that will hopefully get them into top-tier schools, and make them more attractive to different job markets. But I really want to encourage us to think of that as a tertiary goal here. At the heart of classical education, as I'm sure you guys are well informed, it's about developing the habits of mind and action to live a truly good and human life. And so I think if modern technology has reshaped our ideas of what it means to be human, then classical education, right, is an attempt to recover and preserve what it truly means to be human and to lead a good life. And this, right, education isn't just something that happens in the classroom. It's something that happens and extends far beyond the classroom. And so, as I was thinking of this conversation today, one of the things that Emile brought up was, how should parents think about these things outside of the classroom, these technologies outside of the classroom. And I would just encourage that, formation is something that happens at home as well. You're engaged in that project at home. And if that's true, then it's not going to be enough just to excise screens from the classroom. We have to think about how we're actually using these things at home and integrating them at home at various ages. So I have more thoughts on that, but I'll leave it at that, and then we can get into more in the discussion. So.
Well, thank you, Jared. And I think we're really starting to tease out a central question that I wanted to get to here on the panel, which is really just whether, we talked about, Jared at the beginning mentioned how modern technology has done a lot of great things. John mentioned how, technology is not exactly a tool. And I do want to get into then whether these new digital technologies are in some ways intrinsically different from your telephone that came before. But I actually do think that Emma's remarks will really set us up nicely for that. I've learned a ton from Emma about reproductive technologies, about the horrors of the IVF industry and the surrogacy industry. She's really an expert on that topic, and I think can get to some really interesting thoughts on just how technology in general is manifest in some ways that might be quite anti-human. So Emma Waters, the Heritage Foundation, I have it here, your official title, Policy Analyst in the Center for Technology and Human Person at the Heritage Foundation, doing great work. Hand it over to Emma.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emile, and thank you all for being here today. As we arrived this morning, I knew we were getting close because I lost all service and my map started going rerouting, and we just sort of kept going down the road until we found you guys. But it is truly a pleasure to be with you on a Saturday morning of all times. So as Emile said, I spend most of my time talking about reproductive technology, emerging biotechnologies, and basically anywhere that technology intersects with human conception and early development. And typically when I'm speaking on these topics, I begin using the analogy of social media. And I say, guys, we know that an unregulated use of social media has been really bad for human beings. Now let's apply this thinking to reproductive technology. I have the benefit of being with people this morning who I think are fully aligned on reproductive technology. So we can actually flip it and start with reproductive technology and say, guys, we know that this unfettered use and frankly, the use of IVF and surrogacy itself has borne horrific consequences on our society when it comes to the sanctity of human life, the number of embryos that are destroyed, this modern consumer eugenics through companies like Orchid and Nucleus Genomics, where we're now testing embryos to try to assess the potential IQ or personality or health or sex of the embryo, right? If you can measure it, they will try to sell it to you, basically. And we know without a doubt, right, that is changing the way that we think about children and we think about the purpose of marriage and parenthood in the United States and across the world. And as Emile and I think, well, Jared and John, everyone has pointed out today, that it's not simply a question of do I personally use these technologies, but that these technologies simply existing are influencing the world that we're in. And even the sort of secondary assumptions we make about children, about having children, right? So think of it, it's very common now to say we're going to make a baby, we're going to create a baby, we're going to build a baby. Very mechanical language applied to something that is otherwise incredibly sacred and should be totally outside both the market and the space of technological innovation. So my initial remarks had a lot to do with McLuhan, but I think McLuhan's been largely covered. And so what I will say is when I began working, I was actually interning at the Institute for Family Studies, working in family policy. And a couple of years ago, I started working for a technology podcast. And I just became increasingly aware of, in 2019, 2020, and 2021, the ways that technology and what it means to be human were increasingly intersected. You had the rise in the transgender transgender movement, where we are trying to use medical technologies to reshape the outside features of a person. You have in vitro fertilization and surrogacy trying to remake conception as we understand it. And so that's what really birthed my interest in these topics and of how we think about human flourishing. So what I will say is that based on McLuhan, he talks about the psychic and social consequences of a given technology. So as John said, it's not simply what a technology does, but it's how it shapes the world around us. And our technologies not only shape the world around us, but they shape us. And so we create technologies create us, and it's this back and forth interplay. And so of course it's a back and forth interplay that happens in each area of technology, each area of society. So with reproductive technologies, we typically see, or in many cases, we see IVF arise from a deeply human desire for life, for family, for healing from infertility. But in using IVF or in using surrogacy, for example, they often bypass the relational and embodied and even sacramental aspects of human procreation. And so in our attempt to control life and try to correct something that is broken or wrong in the human body, we actually end up disconnecting from the gift of life itself, and this nature of receiving life as a blessing and as a gift. And with that, children inevitably become projects, whether we think of them intentionally in that way or not. And the womb becomes this machine. And the rise of artificial wombs or surrogates is a great example of that. If you can sort of extract body parts and market those body parts as individual things, it's a radically different view than viewing the human person as this embodied and complete person. And of course, just because we can do something with technology doesn't mean we should. So when a given technology substitutes rather than supplements, we tend to move from aid to alienation with the human body and technology. So not every technological advancement honors the human person, and as IVF shows us, there are limits to the ways that humans should use technology. Now, reproductive technology is not a one-for-one analogy with AI, but I think there are many parallels that are informative for us today. First and foremost, that there are limitations on how we should use technology, and yet the way that technology can change the way we view a human person is almost infinite if we don't put those boundaries in place. And if we abandon our role as stewards over that technology, then we risk becoming slaves to it. And I think that's the distinction we're really making today, is that we want to steward over our technology. We want to be the ones in the seat controlling how technology influences our family culture, our education, and that really is the task before us today. And so one of the analogies or phrases my husband came up with is atoms to angels. And so he says that humans have dominion over all of creation, from atoms to angels, referring to 1 Corinthians 6:3 that says, "Do you not know that we are to judge angels? How much more than matters pertaining to this life?" And Psalm 8:6 says that you have given him dominion over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet. And so I think it's really important to approach this conversation with the view that we have dominion over technology. That is actually our God-given responsibility. And so we should think about all of these things as something that we are to guide and steward well. And as a mother of 2 small children who is still working, I understand and value efficiency very highly. And I want to be able to do things as well as I can within the shortest amount of time in cases, so there's room for everything that needs to be done. And so in many ways, I think developments in AI and large language models are a huge blessing, because they can automate tasks that otherwise would have taken me a lot of time and taken away from spending time with my girls or working on a presentation like this. But I think what's so key in this conversation is the presence of wisdom, and that we need wisdom to know how things work, and then also know how we should use them in a way that honors the Lord and honors the limitations that God has placed on us. So there have been a number of different frameworks that people have used. Oliver O'Donovan, an Anglican ethicist, uses the distinction of restore versus circumvent. Brad, Claire, and I came up with a distinction of hack versus heal. And then Joshua Mitchell has a distinction of substitute versus supplement when it comes to distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy uses of technology. And I think that Mitchell's is particularly helpful for us today. And so he says that supplements support and strengthen natural human functions, while substitutes create dependence and undermine those very functions. So applying it to IVF, we would say that IVF substitutes the human body and natural fertility by bypassing the body altogether and actually outsourcing procreation to a lab and technicians. Whereas something like natural family planning or restorative reproductive medicine is a supplement. And so it's using technology and medical innovation to actually diagnose and heal the human body so that it's able to do what it was meant to do, which is conceive within that union of marriage. And so while substitutes tend to replace what is human with technology, supplements use technology to support human flourishing. And so when it comes to our conversations of digital technologies and AI, that's the distinction that I think is really helpful, thinking about ways that this technology can serve us in the goals that we have, in the culture we want to build, and the families we want to cultivate. So we can use AI, of course, to substitute real learning and real emotional development. And as I said, there are ways that it can supplement us. I am not anti-technology by any means, nor am I a doomer when it comes to the future with AI and other technologies. But I think we must be wise as serpents and innocent as doves as we navigate this new world for ourselves and for our children. And there are, of course, numerous concerns that come with AI and the use of anyone, but especially children, including exposure to inappropriate content. And even like the kid-friendly AI programs can easily be tricked into sexually explicit conversations with minors, as recent articles for The Atlantic have shown. There's concerns about data, like privacy concerns with children sharing private information about themselves and even having that leaked to other people. And then, of course, there's the heavy cultural bias and ideological bent in all AI programs. I have tried multiple times to feed something really positive about the president to ChatGPT, and somehow ChatGPT in every single instance manages to respond back without mentioning anything to do with the president. And it'll just naturally filter out things that it doesn't want. So it's not even what ChatGPT is telling you, it's what it's not telling you in the answers that I have found to be incredibly concerning. And it's that omission that can actually be, I think, far more detrimental to what we're learning and how we're thinking. So for my last few minutes on remarks, I want to focus on academic excellence and then emotional formation when it comes to AI, because it's not just what we do with AI, but it's what AI is doing to us. So the first, when it comes to academic excellence, is how it undermines independent thought and creativity. So in classical education, we strive to form children who think clearly, reason well, and express themselves with beauty and precision. AI tools like Gemini or ChatGPT or other variations can short circuit that formation by encouraging children of any age to outsource their thinking and creativity. Instead of wrestling with ideas or developing original thoughts, students may become dependent on quick automated responses. And this habit runs counter to the cultivation of virtue and intellectual discipline. So Matthew Crawford has talked about the distinction between self-expression and mastery. And we also think of, we often think of creativity as like, go out in nature and express yourself, become creative. And it's a great idea until you realize you have no idea how to be creative, because true creativity is actually comes after you master a topic. So how do you riff on the guitar? You first mastered the guitar. You understand the chords, the progressions, the variations, and then you know how to be creative. But AI and this like outsourcing of our thought and creativity doesn't actually help us be more creative. It just sort of limits the scope of what we can achieve because we don't understand a thing before we actually try to engage with it. The second is that ChatGPT, especially when it comes to education, promotes falsehoods with the illusion of authority. So classical education places a high value on truth, of course, and we want to teach students to discern what is good, true, and beautiful. AI platforms, however, often generate false or misleading information, what developers call hallucinations. And so while an adult and brilliant minds like yourself in this room may easily be able to spot where ChatGPT is making something up, children do not have the ability to discern between what is true and what is incorrect. And frankly, many adults don't either, especially when you're relying on ChatGPT to supplement research or findings with you. And then then of course, as a part of all of this is that AI really enables a whole new form of cheating, right? Like, what does it actually mean to do your homework when you can just plug in the answer and get a really good response from ChatGPT, from econ to statistics to research and writing? It's a completely different world. And so something that I've heard from a number of our friends teaching at classical schools is that their students all get 100s on the homework and then 40s on their tests because they're just all using AI. And to Jared's point, the more you use AI, the less you're actually learning based on the studies that we see. So your ability to recall information, your memory is being decreased as you outsource your thinking. And then the second portion on this I think is so important is the way that AI shapes our relationships and the way that we engage with one another. And so one of the most significant differences between traditional search engines and AI tools like ChatGPT lies in how the information is being communicated. So search engines, you say, how do I cook lasagna? And it returns a list of articles and recipes for your review. But ChatGPT, by contrast, is conversational and relational in its very structure. And it's designed to build an emotional connection with the user. It's not just giving you information, it's actually talking to you and trying to shape the way that you think and feel about that information. And so such interactions train us to expect relationships that are friction-free, always available, and on our own terms. So like a relational instant gratification. And for young people especially, this is incredibly dangerous. And so one of the most recent areas this is arising is through the realm of like AI girlfriends and boyfriends and friends and therapists, AI really replacing human connection and relationship. And I'm sure many of you have read the stories of individuals proposing to their AI girlfriend or trying to commit suicide when their AI counterpart rejects them. And these are extreme versions, but I think represent what is a very natural inclination, especially in younger people, to try to connect with the thing that's easiest to connect to. And AI offers this easy to connect, always available friend, but it's actually completely counter to what a real and healthy relationship is. And then finally, I am hesitant to give any advice to real parents because I have a 2-year-old and a 7-month-old, and it's really easy to not have them in front of screens or talking to ChatGPT, mostly because they can't even type yet. So this is all really easy for me to think about. So the area of application that really stands out most to me is it comes down to how I use AI, how I engage with digital technologies, because ultimately children mirror the habits and the values that you set. And so I think that's where it makes the most sense to really end today is this introspection on what is your relationship with technology. When you become bored or disgruntled or need someone to talk to, like what is the natural place that you reach out to? How do you respond? Because even if your children don't have screens, they will see you using screens or see the way that you engage with these digital technologies, and that's ultimately what they will reflect and embody in their own life. And so I think to the degree that, I think one of the most powerful things that we can do is actually just steward our own use of these technologies. And that will be such a powerful example to your children and how they actually grow up engaging with them.
Well, thank you, Emma. That's a good place to start our discussion because I think we're all in agreement that we need to have mastery over our technology, that it needs to serve human goods rather than us serving the technologies. I think perhaps I'm the most techno-pessimist here on the stage. I'm inclined to go full Luddite. I don't understand this new stuff at all. But also another reason for that is I guess I'm just I'm sort of skeptical about whether, especially with some of this new artificial intelligence, whether just that the nature of that is such that it is meant to attack our humanity. I mean, Emma mentioned a lot of these really dystopian things coming out about AI and about the way, especially with young people, that really preys on our human vulnerabilities. So I want to start there because I think, John, especially if I recall correctly, you are a skeptic about some of these apocalyptic prognostications about AI, and perhaps even think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but can this be used for good? Can we harness AI for something that might be positive within a human framework? Curious to get you guys' thoughts on that. Well, but we'll start with John. Where am I wrong that AI is not all bad?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I think you have to start by disaggregating what do we mean by AI, right? Mostly now, when people say AI, they're talking about chatbots based on large language model technology. You can have a longer, more complicated discussion about the connections between the internet economy, attention economy, and AI. But as a matter of fact, the chatbot is not the only way to use LLMs, right? It's actually kind of I wouldn't quite say an accident of history, but the chatbot is an accidental discovery along as people were exploring what they could do with LLM technology. So all these companies, including OpenAI, I mean, I was using OpenAI before ChatGPT. Now it was before it was sort of publicly released. They had a private sandbox that researchers could get access to. It was very powerful technology, but it was very different than how sort of the chatbot works. So already, people are using AI and large language models to build agents and sort of run on their own in ways that are really, I think, interesting and useful. So, and not necessarily, that's sort of completely separate from the chatbot interface, right? So there's a world, right, where, for example, for today, debugging a computer program, or before LLMs, debugging a computer program could be there are all kinds of tools for it. They didn't necessarily work that well. It was very labor intensive, right? There's a world in which you can give an agent, AI agent, pretty much plain English instructions on doing X, Y, and Z, and then the LLM will produce an output that you can review or whatever, right? A very different modality, very different way of working with it than the kind of chatbot experience, right? They can come up with a lot of other examples of ways of engaging with this technology and the technologies underlying it that look very different than you're texting your AI girlfriend. Right? So that's sort of the first point. So we should think about we should disaggregate what we mean with this technology a little bit. The second point, in terms of as a matter of practice, Steve Jobs once called the computer sort of bicycle for the mind. And this is something that Emma sort of began to gesture towards. What these technologies do, digital technology in general, artificial intelligence in particular, they amplify the human mind. Whatever you put in is what you will get out. The better the inputs you put in, the better outputs you will get, right? It's actually increased the premium for the liberal arts. The better you are at using the English language, the more you know of art, history, literature, languages, etc., the more sophisticated ways you'll be able to use these technologies, right? The people who have lost the most with AI are actually people who bet on the kind of industrial model of education, of separating actual knowledge about the world from so-called critical thinking skills, critical reading skills. That industrial model of education, which says that your process of learning and knowledge acquisition is separated from a process of formation and actual substantive knowledge about history and Western civilization. Those people are totally lost, right? So this is a total victory for classical education, actually, and liberal education. And even in the classroom, yes, I don't think you should have students sitting on screens talking to chatbots that will not learn a single thing. But for teachers, and I've done this myself as a professor, AI makes it much easier to customize materials, to produce the kinds of elaborate things that maybe you'd want to produce. Like, for example, I do these scenario exercises when I teach international relations, and I was able to use Claude to produce a really elaborate scenario with customized, for all 30 students who were doing this role-playing exercise, customized instructions for them. In a way that would have taken me dozens of hours to do, and I just would not have done it because I wouldn't have time to have done it without AI. So I think there are a lot of different ways to use AI, but of course one has to be very thoughtful.
But to your point, right? AI worked for you because you had been classically educated before that.
Absolutely.
Right. And so I think that's the danger, and that's what Emma mentioned before, is that especially in the K-12 space, if you don't provide that baseline before introducing the AI, they're going to end up, potentially as a professor, if they're still doing PhDs at that point, who can't actually do the input.
No, 100%. So I think, it's a technology you absolutely want to keep out of the classroom for reasons that we all know. But one of the implications of that, or one of the benefits of that, is when you actually have formed the person, when they actually educated them, they're going to be far better at using the technology. There was this sort of very silly idea from like the 2010s that we needed laptops in the classroom so people could learn how to use a computer. A computer is a very easy device to learn how to use, right? And they're only getting easier. Tablets are extremely easy devices to learn how to use. What's hard to learn how to use is how to think, how to write, how to understand the world. So train someone to think, write, and understand the world, and they're going to be even better at using computers and laptops.
And you feel that AI is similar, that it is not a sort of demonstrable shift, that it is going to be easy to use if you're classically educated.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
So, Jared, I want to bring you in on that point. I'm curious what you think about John's sort of antidote to the harms of modern technologies. I know that you've spoken a lot about how technology, and especially AI, can become an idol from a sort of more theological perspective. And I think it's a really interesting point, especially given our current moment where we're seeing a big time return to religion. It's fantastic. There's a stabilization of the decline in traditional Christianity here in this country. The Catholic Church just saw a huge record number of baptisms over the Easter Vigil. So great news on that front. But I'm just curious, Jared, how you think about that trend with the rise of AI, given your thoughts on how these technologies can become an idol.
Yeah, well, I think I'd want to say, so a little bit of backstory on me. A lot of my interest in the kind of technological problem and policy issues of today really were birthed out of a kind of in-depth study of looking through like Pope John Paul II's theology of the body and thinking through, right, if this thesis is true, that modern technologies obscure kind of the truth of who we are as creatures, then how do we return and recover that truth, right? If there's that void that's being created in our use of day-to-day technologies, then where do we turn? And so I think in a lot of ways, a theology or a faith, especially Christianity, that can uphold the value and the goodness, the original created goodness of the body, I think is something that's really attractive to people. And I think there's a certain degree, this is one of the reasons that I've really appreciated John Paul II is, even as a Protestant, is understanding that he has this kind of optimism that if we really pay attention to the world, to its structure and to its order and to our experience of it, it will open itself up in truth to us. So there's this optimism of natural revelation, and I think that's really important. And I think people feel that absence in a digital age, that for all of the chats that they can have with an AI bot or all the virtual sex they can have, it's not as good as the real embodied thing. And so I think there's a hunger in the hearts of people for that, for sure. And I think that's, I think that's a really critical component, is that the body bears witness to these things by the way that God created it. And so even if I think this is part of what keeps me from being a total doomer on this. I do share your pessimism.
Come on over. It's the right side.
But I think that's something that can mitigate against this sort of the presentation of this myth of inevitable progress, right? Is that, there's a lot of psychological research on these things, both pop level and otherwise, but there's the sense of that the body really has its own structure, and that when you remove the person from an embodied the embodied connection and learning and engagement it was made for, that's going to come up and swing back at some point.
So, Emma, I appreciated your doomerism on the end there. But I think as moderator, I do need to, I guess, flip the script. And, you do so much great work on all of the real problems that technology poses. What are some of the biggest opportunities that these modern technologies present for us from your perspective?
Yeah, this is a really good question. My husband and I were talking about this on the drive up this morning, and we were talking about how if I was sitting in a room full of Silicon Valley execs, I would say something very different, and I would warn about all of the barriers and limitations that they're just completely ignoring and how bad it will be for humanity. But because I'm sitting around people who probably broadly share my assumptions and worldview, how important it is to outline what the most important developments are, the opportunities that AI and digital technology offers us. So I think the first one that most closely intersects with my work is the opportunities when it comes to our health, fertility, and medical innovation. We have unprecedented opportunities to understand disease like never before, specifically the use of large language models to aggregate data that's more than reasonably any human could do to understand connections between different genes or symptoms or environments that can result in certain diseases. Specifically the use of AI and just generally like technological innovation when it comes to treating things like infertility. So in the United States today, about 15 to 30% of all infertility diagnoses come down to unexplained infertility, which is just a short way of saying the doctor didn't know what was going on and probably didn't do his due diligence in figuring out what it was, and instead they just stick them to the substitute IVF and move on. But we're actually seeing more and more opportunities to actually assess individual health with the backdrop of numerous other test cases to understand and be able to diagnose those particular cases. So I think in the realm of like health and a general longevity, we have incredible opportunities. There's also times I think of like the COVID pandemic where many churches weren't meeting in person or you were just at a great distance from your loved ones. And I think initially things like digital technology actually served as a great supplement. So allowing you to meet together congregationally as a church or meet with your family or attend baby showers together, right? Now, continuing to use AI and digital technology to replace human interaction now, I think becomes a substitute and is really inappropriate. But I think you have those opportunities where it can actually help connect people. My husband and I were long distance for most of our dating. So digital technology was fantastic because we actually got to see each other's face, even if we couldn't see each other in person for a few weeks at a time. So those are a few of the ways I think it's been really, it will continue to be really helpful in sort of supplementing the things that we really value. And one of the things that I think is so important on this is I oftentimes feel this like overwhelming pressure of like, okay, it's not just about taking something bad away, but it's about putting something good in. So therefore, we should move to a farm and we should have full programming all day where we're riding ponies and we're gardening, and then my kids will have a full life and everything will be great. And the reality is that's just not practical or possible for a lot of people. There's still ways you can integrate that in your day-to-day life. But something that Ross Douthat said in a opinion piece of his recently was that anything that's not explicitly named will be forgotten. And so I think when it comes to this conversation on AI and digital technologies and the opportunities it provides us, is that one of the best things you can do as parents is continue to say the true things that your generation likely assumed. So you assumed that family is good, that religion is good, that marriage is good, that children are good, that learning is good, right? All of these things that we just assume in the room, we cannot assume that like the next generation will grow up with those presuppositions. And so what does it look like just to continue restating those things in very explicit terms, right? Like, wow, it is so good that you can study Latin today because here's how Latin sets you up for this. Wow, marriage is so good. Here's what I love about being married. And just those very practical things. I think that's actually in many cases just that countercultural explicitly say what you assumed because the next generation won't be able to assume it, and continue reinforcing those values because that's ultimately what sustains us and gives us the proper foundation to then be able to navigate and implement these other developing technologies.
Emma, we do have a lot of horses out here in Warren County, so it is doable. You got to get out of the city. So I want to make things concrete before we open it up to our audience for Q&A. Because I think that we see in the public square right now some really interesting impulses when it comes to modern technology. So you think about the emergent tech right? Someone like Elon Musk who loves babies and has questionable ways of creating those babies. But there's this real sort of accelerationist impulse among the tech right? So that's one approach to technology, that it's going to solve all of our problems. We're going to all go live on Mars. And then you have the Maha wing, right? Now, there's some overlap on all of these. There's a fair amount of raw milk here in Front Royal. But this is the group, right, who would completely object to lab-grown meat, who wants all of the seed oils out of food, who's really going back to the land, right? And so it seems to me like we have at the same time in our public square these two really competing impulses when it comes to a lot of these modern technologies. Now, a lot of people are going to fall in the middle, right? I think perhaps many in this room may have fall in the middle on that. But I'm just curious from you guys' perspective, I guess what's driving those different impulses? Again, if we're trying to get upstream and sort of think conceptually about technology, what's driving those two competing impulses? And then I guess what does each one get right, and what does each one fall short on? John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll be a little bit careful because this is my everyday lived reality. I'll keep things at a high level, but I think you're missing a very important third piece, which is sort of the, social conservatives, basically, which share some sympathies with both. I think maybe a little bit more with the Maha folks, but I think what's more interesting is what they agree on. Actually, what they disagree on is kind of obvious, right? There's a very interesting zone of agreement, though, which is that both sides agree that the existing structures of how we regulate and moderate technological change have deeply failed, right? They've on the one hand restricted many kinds of activity. I wouldn't say even technological activity, many kinds of building, many like physically building in the world, many kinds of scientific research, actually, based on how funding is operated, many kinds of pharmaceuticals, many kinds of medical research, right? They've sort of decided that one very narrow way of understanding health and understanding how we research health and research outcomes was the only right way to do it, and they ignored massively growing evidence something had gone deeply wrong in American society and American health. Right? Both the sides agree on that, right? And so that's actually where there's a lot. It's very interesting, right? Like the Department of Health and Human Services Secretary is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the patriarch of the Maha movement, the leader of the Maha movement, and his deputy is Jim O'Neill, who has worked on biotech for Peter Thiel for a very long time, right? And that's actually not so much an odd couple pairing as people think, because they agree in this sort of core question. I think when you sort of take a step further removed, though, and you look at, where are we driving towards? I think both sides are missing something. I think there is a kind of instinctual aversion to technology in the Maha group that sometimes is quite ill-founded, right? Maybe it's an unpopular thing to say in this group, but we do have a pasteurization process for a reason, right? Now, so here's a very interesting thing.
Anathema, John. I can't believe you would say this.
Yeah. No, this is the most controversial thing that's been said today. So, on the one hand, here's the point of agreement, right? The scientific establishment says, because we have an industrial system of producing milk, we're going to mix it all together, and there's lots of chances for bacteria and other things to spread. You have to pasteurize or ultra-pasteurize all milk. The only way to have safe milk is pasteurized and ultra-pasteurized milk. That was not scientifically based, right? That was a particularly industrial mode of agricultural production that was enforced by governmental monopoly, right? And the tech people would completely agree with that, right? So both sides would say, now, the flip side, though, of raw milk is safe. There are, on the margins anyways, there are problems with that idea. There is a synthesis to be had, though, which is we can use technology. We can use digital technology's ability to track, for example, milk production and produce a decentralized milk market system that doesn't rely on industrial aggregation to bring you closer to your suppliers, to have more humane agriculture in ways that is safer, and as well as to trace outbreaks of things if there are problems, right? So I think there's a kind of synthesis of the two. And then, of course, that's the problem with the Maha people. The problem on the tech accelerationist side is oftentimes there's a technophilia, a love of which is really a neophilia, a love of the new, whether or not it's better or not, and maybe just as importantly, without thinking about technological change as a change in the scale, pace, and pattern of human life. I was on a group chat with a lot of people, most of whom were sort of tech right, some of whom were more sort of Maha oriented. And one of the most controversial things that was raised was the Florida lab-grown meat ban, which some of the tech people saw as just,
Can you get into that a little bit in case anyone's not
so
familiar?
the state of Florida preemptively banned lab-grown meat, right? And the tech people.
This is like no animal products, right? Like this is just like grown in lab, or
Yeah, like grown in lab, like soy-based. Well, it's not sorry, lab-grown. So it's not like soy. Like you can have a fake soy meat patty, but like actually, the way they grow like synthetic animal protein, lab-grown meat. Yeah, they banned it preemptively, and some of the tech people thought this was like a huge state imposition, state stopping innovation, etc. Those of us who I think understand the issues better said, no, this is, regardless of the health problem, the social ramifications of this will be so tremendous and so dystopian that it makes sense to ban it preemptively. So anyways, that's how I would say, like, what do they have in common, and where do each side go wrong?
Emma?
I think just putting a very fine point on what John said, both of these movements value free thinking and innovation and dynamism, and really elevate the individual's ability to think and discern and make decisions for themselves in ways that I think are really exciting, and are a necessary counter. And in some sense, I want both of these movements to continue warring with each other, because I think what happens in the middle is like where the rest of us live, is this sort of neutral zone, or not neutral zone, but the sort of like commonality, right? Where like we have our raw milk, but also we're kind of excited about space exploration, and like, I don't know, a colony on Mars could be kind of cool. And you sort of want to see how both play out, but having the freedom to be a little bit removed from both of those movements, I think it's been really healthy to see. So I think that's probably one of the most encouraging things that we've seen. The thing that I think is most concerning, specifically with the like pro-technological innovation space, is that there's this emphasis on constantly living in the moment or in the future, and what can you get, what can you gain, and there's this forgetting of what has been. And so in the Psalms, this one verse that's always in my mind is the psalmist says, "Teach me to number my days, that I may gain a heart of wisdom." And there's this sense that memory and the ability to recall and learn from our past, for better or worse, is the basis. It's the teacher. It's one of the ways that we pursue wisdom. And wisdom is probably one of the most central themes throughout all of Scripture. Scripture never says be the smartest person in the room. It says pursue excellence and seek wisdom, right? Which is the beginning, which begins with this fear of the Lord, this awe and reverence for our Creator. And I think either movement, especially the pro-tech movement, forgets that and pursues these future things at their own detriment. And so I think that's probably the thing that I would really leave here, sort of outside of both of those movements, is the central calling for us today is to pursue wisdom, because in pursuing wisdom, we're ultimately pursuing Jesus Christ. And that is the foundation upon which all of our life, all of our flourishing, our understanding of what it means to be human is ultimately found. And it gives us the freedom to steward over technology, to take what is good, discard what is bad, and generally, right, be very optimistic. When I initially read the remarks of Emile about for this life and the life to come, I thought we meant eternal life. So I was like, this is, maybe you did, or maybe you just meant life after school. I don't know. But in both cases,
all of the above.
right, like whatever the case was, it's true, right? And ultimately, right, like all of our technological innovation is simply pointing us to this eternal life, where we live in glorified bodies in a glorified city. And so I think there's this hope that should that should orient all of our conversations, because ultimately we do know the end. And so in the meantime, we're called to seek wisdom and to get married and have children and work faithfully in the land that we've been given. And I think that's where I would end it.
I certainly agree with that. I don't know about Mars. Maryland is already too far from home for me, so we'll leave it there. I want to hear from you guys. We should, I believe, have a mic. If we can get our student ambassador to help us with the mic, we could potentially have one coming around. If not, we're in a small enough room. We can probably hear you guys. But I guess we can start with shouting. I can repeat it through the mic. If you have a question, please do raise your hand for our panel, and we will get to you guys. Yep, I think we have one right back here, and I think we do actually have a mic coming for you.
Thank you. So in this world in which technology, digital technology in particular, is so pervasive, how do you address parents who might be looking at classical education, especially in high school, and easily dismiss it, saying, oh, you're tech-free, that's not going to work because almost all careers are going to require some sort of knowledge and familiarity with technology.
I hope you're able to stick around for our keynote conversation, because that's absolutely the question we're going to address. But I don't know if you guys have thoughts on that to begin with.
I'd be happy to jump in. Again, I'm speaking not from a place of having kids, so my wisdom is very limited. But I would say that I think, again, one of the things we've noticed, and that's being discussed when it comes to like preparation for the upcoming AI economy, right? A lot of things like soft skills, people skills are going to be really important, and so actually learning to engage with other humans in person is really critical. Learning how to navigate challenging social situations or conflict, like all of those things are going to become incredibly valuable, and so being more in person, more present in those ways. And then I think just generally this idea that the only thing that's valuable is what's economically productive is, that's misguided. And whether it's using these new technologies or learning them, I think a lot of what classical schools have to offer, especially one that prioritizes the sense of adventure, the sense of being out in nature, right? There are other kinds of technologies or tools that a lot of wisdom can be gained from. And so I'm thinking alongside the liberal arts, right, has long stood what was once called the mechanical arts. So learning how to engage the world through more hand-wrought tools. There are alternative forms of technology that are just as valuable. I mean, you could probably get a great starting salary as a welder, if you want to do that sort of thing. It's going to be a different kind of work, but I think just there's other value here and other ways to measure that. That's how I would weigh in.
I would say 4 of the 5 top tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley were raised with Montessori or classical education. The people who were succeeding the most in this technological age weren't people who grew up with a tech-heavy childhood, in part because of their age, but they're also raising their children that way. So I think it's looking at who are the excellent figures, or maybe just the very successful figures in this technological age that you want your children to be like or gain from, and then sort of piecing back from there. And we see free thinking or classical education as the basis for that. And then second, maybe just a let's get real parents. Your kids aren't doing anything that intelligent on their phones to begin with. I'm not doing anything that intelligent on my phone to begin with, right? Like, we have this idea that technology is always like this great exploration of new things, but let's be honest, at most I'm using Google Documents and Google Sheets. I maybe am like checking my finances, or I'm just scrolling social media, and that's what children are doing 99% of the time. And if you think that prepares your kid well, then I would just ask them what career and what kind of relationship it's actually preparing them well for. Looking at the fact that a growing number of kids want to be YouTube influencers, right? Like, that's the thing they want to grow up to be. That tells you something, and you can make a lot of money and do cool things, but that's probably not tenable for most people, and it's probably not actually the thing that brings you the greatest satisfaction in life. So that would be my response.
John?
Just to kind of double tap on that. Again, this is one of the things that people say that they haven't even thought about for 5 seconds. It's obviously not true, in the sense that, if you look at any career, the valuable thing is not the things that everyone knows how to do, like use Google, use an AI chatbot, use Microsoft Word. The extent that there's technology involved is at the very limit. And spending a lot of time using technology in very mediocre ways does not advance your career skills at all, right? So yeah, if your kids, so if a kid wants to be a computer engineer, yes, he should have a computer, but he shouldn't be playing around on YouTube. He should be soldering a circuit board, or coding something from scratch. There is absolutely value, and many of these tech founders who have done very well, who did have maybe a little more technology background, that's what they were doing in high school. They weren't messing around on YouTube.
Other questions? Yeah, right back here. I think we got a mic coming for you.
I might be one of the few ones here, a grandma, very soon. So you were talking about wisdom, and the virtue that was coming to my mind was humility. Because sometimes we focus on what this is doing to the children, but actually is doing the same thing to us. And we might tend to look into what they are going to do, or possibly, but we are the ones doing it. And someone, I don't know who, said we need to be intentional. My kids, when they were coming from college, Christmas, summer, we had to sit down with them and establish again the family environment. All of them were in Catholic colleges, but the reality is that we are also contagious with our own habits. So we are not, it really affects us, everyone around us, and what the other people are doing. And the other thing that I will say, and maybe someone can mention this or get deeper, I have seen the effect on prayer life with the use of phones and the possibility of praying with what you have there. The idea of leisure, of contemplative, it is getting a little bit lost and being uncomfortable to be in silence in your own prayer.
So that's an interesting point. And if I can sort of reframe it as well, the Hallow app, very popular. Good or bad, how does technology relate to prayer?
Yeah, I'll start and others should jump in. This is a fantastic question and remarks. There's so many things. First is that one of the things that's really weighed on me is how detrimental technology has actually been for older generations who had absolutely no framework to process it when it just hit society at large scale. I've been incredibly critical of like Wi-Fi broadband expansions because of this, because all of a sudden you take a people who have really no background in advanced technologies or in urban living, and then you give them the full expanse of the internet. And I think it's just been horrible for pornography, for wasting hours on Netflix, for scrolling social media. It's actually had far fewer benefits than we hoped because in many cases there wasn't an education in virtue and wisdom to understand how to engage with this technology. So something that Claire Morell and I think others here have often said is that we should think about the implementation of any digital technologies, including AI, similar to how we think about a driver's license, right? You don't just give your 5-year-old the keys and say, good luck, figure it out. Although my dad did that growing up in a rural community, but that's beside the point. But you wait to an appropriate age when they have the maturity to begin to process it. You put them through a course where they learn how to drive and road signs and what these things are, understand it first. You then give them the keys and you ride with them. You talk with them through it, right? And then, only then, once they've mastered those things, do you give them the freedom to drive. And should they act irresponsibly, right, then there are repercussions too, where then you take away some of those freedoms. And so I think thinking about our engagement with technology along similar lines is really helpful. Things like, speaking of the prayer app, there's a quote from John Piper that always sticks out in my mind where he said that on the last day when you're standing before God and God asks you, why did you not pray? And we say, well, God, we were so busy. Then he says that there's a very good chance God could then just pull up your social media use and say, well, I can think of thousands of hours you could have been praying that you weren't. And that just always stands out to me, is that technology has this ability to make us feel like we're doing something that's hidden, right? Or we are doing something that's hidden, right? Like it's only between us and our phone, us and the internet. No one else will know about it. It won't have repercussions beyond that. And that's really the nature of sin and shame, right? Is that it calls us into that hidden place where then we feel like we're free from accountability. And so as much as possible, adding in that accountability to our technology. Things like the Halo app or things like FemTech. I'm wearing the Oura Ring. It tracks my temperature every morning and helps me track my fertility. I think those are really good supplements if used as supplements, but I also think that things like the Hallow app, it's really easy to be reading the phone on your Bible, then see a notification and click off of it. And so again, coming down to the medium as the message, I don't use any sort of like scripture, worship, prayer apps on my phone because I'm way too easily distracted. And if the medium is the message, then what am I actually saying about scripture and about prayer if I'm using my phone as the medium to God when scripture tells us we have direct access to God, and there's something actually very profound about human communion, soul to soul, that we should maybe be pursuing rather than relying on our phones as the medium there.
Perhaps time for one brief question before lunch because I don't want to hold you guys from the food for too long. Yeah, we got one back in the corner right there.
one question I have that I think as parents is hard is, at what age is it appropriate to give your son or daughter an iPhone, not just a phone? And I've been, there's a lot of research about brain development, like when women's brains are fully formed and when men's are. And when you look at it, it seems like, oh, when they go to college, they get a phone. But it seems like if you look at the studies, it really shouldn't be until after college. But how do we navigate this with their social, it does seem that if you don't have a phone or you're not connected, then you're not invited, it's kind of like a milestones. But in many ways, I don't know if you have any advice or input on that next step of preparing them, but at what point, what is the appropriate age for the iPhone?
The social aspect is very real, and I know that Claire Morell and Brad Littlejohn will have a lot to say on that this afternoon. Does anyone have thoughts on that to start, John?
Yeah, I'll my oldest is only 8, so we're only kind of now getting into this. I think before adolescence, you can just kind of like not have something, and that's just the rule, and that's kind of how it is, and people deal with it. But I think it gets much harder when kids get older. I'd say 2 things. One, especially when it comes to social media, it really takes a village. It takes a community, because the how important that is, having or not having social media, is entirely dependent on what people's friends are doing. It's social media. So if nobody you know uses social media, it's really easy not to care at all or not to be involved at all. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, I think with adolescence, you begin to have to teach and inform your kids as to the wisdom behind what you set, the rule you set for the family, because there will reach an age where they have to embrace that wisdom as their own in their own practices, or it will become kind of impossible. So for sort of smartphones, I mean, I think for one thing, it's not one age, right? It depends on the kid, right? If you know your kids well enough, that should shape this. I think you also ask, what is it for? When people start driving around, you need ways of using GPS, but there are tools now like the Wise Phone or others that will kind of give you modern GPS without all the other bits and bops. I will say, unfettered internet access is not something I'm sure adults should have, much less kids of any age. And I wrote an amicus brief for the Supreme Court case that we just won on age verification for pornography. So yeah, I think that's a conversation you have to have with your kids, because they have to understand the wisdom of whatever the policy you've sort of set is.
Just very briefly, I think keeping in mind it doesn't need to be an all or nothing. Sort of as John's remarks were saying, I think there are a lot of intermediary devices that can sort of enable that the benefits of social interaction and social media without it being this all or nothing. And then the only thing I would add is saying, to the degree that we can centralize our technology, and particularly our smartphone technology, in a social public context, the better. So one of my favorite things that my husband and oldest daughter do is they watch these like YouTube compilation videos, like put to some really fun song, and I don't know, like Donald Trump's in there dancing or something. I really don't get it, but my daughter loves it. And it's this like special treat, but it's not my daughter scrolling on a screen by herself, right? It's a special thing she gets to do with her dad in the living room all together. And she dances and she's laughing. So to what degree we can sort of take our smartphones and make it part of put it in a public setting and make it part of a public conversation, the better. And then you're sort of setting your children up as they're going into high school and college and beyond to think about their technology in that way. Yeah, but in going back to what I said earlier, I think just saying the things explicitly, right? Like it's not just, oh, we're not sure if you can handle smartphones, but it's like, here are the concrete things we want you to accomplish and who we want you to be. And then we need to figure out the best version of this phone, the best technology that helps us achieve those goals. And we want you as an active participant in that. And I think at that point, right, pursuing wisdom, pursuing the grace of the Lord will like provide the guidance needed from there.
Well, that is a good note to end it on. Just a quick housekeeping thing before we thank our panel. We have lunch ready for you all. Our Chelsea Parents Association and volunteers have been working tirelessly to get the lunch spread out, so it should be right in the hallway there where you came in, where the registration desk had been. Feel free to go grab lunch, come back to your tables here. No programming during lunch, so you get a break from all of our voices. Feel free to chat and enjoy the company here. We'll be back at 1 o'clock to restart the program. Please thank me in joining our panel.